Uhuru. First of all, I'd like to express my appreciation for the introduction, and beyond that, certainly for the Uhuru Solidarity Movement and African People Solidarity Committee for organizing this incredibly significant convention. And I was really struck by the power of the presenters who preceded me. I've seen Comrade Stephanie, just in terms of her own development and just the strength and confidence with which she just spoke, and the clarity that she has achieved that made it such a powerful presentation. And Comrade Penny Hess, I mean, these were just really brilliant and really important presentations, and it reminds me that the existence, the presence of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, the African People Solidarity Committee, the Solidarity Movement itself is representative of an incredible historical development in this country and in the world. And I say in the world because the ideological basis for the existence of the Uhuru movement does not pertain only to what happens in the United States, but it is actively engaging communities throughout Europe, specifically throughout Europe, and certainly in places like South Africa, where we also have a certain political influence. I think about how this meeting, this conference, this convention, the existence of Uhuru Solidarity Movement is such a material manifestation of real transformation that we've already brought about in this country and in the world. We say overturning the racial divide through solidarity with African liberation. And that is something that's taken for granted in our own movement. But we're talking about a world that's right now still shedding this fantasy, this idealism associated with the contradictions that exist between Africans and white people in the world. This idealism that makes the assumption that somehow this so-called racial divide is a result of white people not liking black people, of white people just having to learn something about Africans, our culture, and who we are, or about Africans ourselves learning how to be better appreciated by white people, to make ourselves somebody who white people will willingly embrace. Somehow this notion of the racial divide seems to revolve around what people think is in the heads of white people, as opposed to something that's really profoundly significant. Of course, it's a really self-serving and really narcissistic assumption that is not embraced by our movement and by most of the people in this room, because it is an obscenity that does not take much work to understand that somehow the problems of the people in the world revolve around what white people think about them. Somebody mentioned a moment ago that Comrade Stephanie, that somebody could be killed because they might look at a white woman. Or I remember the case of Emmett Till, who, when I think was in what they call junior high school, was murdered by white men in Mississippi because he allegedly whistled at a white woman. I remember cases when I was growing up where Africans were either lynched or sentenced to time in prison because they allegedly looked at a white woman. They referred to it as reckless eyeballing. This was the obscenity that Africans and oppressed people have had to live with. In fact, we did not have the right to express an opinion. To express an opinion or a view would get you killed. To say that that's an attractive white woman would get you killed. This is the reality that we've all had to live with. And so this notion that somehow it's the ideas in people's heads that's responsible for this relationship that we have flies in the face of all reason. And of course, it is easy to come to this conclusion when nobody can talk back. It is easy to assume a certain kind of European universality or white universality if nobody can challenge it, if nobody can talk back. This is the way the world is supposed to be, damn it.
Go ahead.
And that's the way it's going to be. And to object, to challenge that, is to do so at the expense of your life, your family, and sometimes the sovereignty of whole countries and peoples have revolved around disagreeing with what white power thought was the rule. So people learn to shuffle, to get along, to survive, to avert their eyes in the presence of white men or white women, so that there was not an assumption that we had an independent thought that might challenge the relationship that we had. This notion of the superiority, supremacy of white people is something that flies in the face of all reason. And of course, most white people know that's not true. And certainly we know that's not true in this room. I mean, white people look in the mirror too. And looking in the mirror, you know, they have to say, God damn, I'm not so all that, am I? You know, they have to come face to face with the fact that, you know, what is happening now, of course, in the world is that people are now talking back. And in so doing, it's challenging every notion that white people have had about yourselves. And this challenges this perception of European or white universality. I mean, this is the way things ought to be. The way they ought to be, obviously, is the way white people, Europe has said, this is what represents civilization. Anything done, anything differently from that deserves to die or be destroyed. And that's the kind of reality that we have, which is, you know, responsible for the formation, self-mutilation of people like Michael Jackson, but not just Michael Jackson, by Vietnamese in South Vietnam who were going to barbershops to have their eyes rounded so they can look more like white people. Or something that happens even in China, parts of China today. It ain't because white people are that. It's because white people have had all the guns and the ability to punish people who acted differently. And I think that, so the point that I'm making is that this notion that somehow the question of these relationships between white people and the rest of the world revolved around ideas like racism, that I should spend the rest of my life getting white people to like me, which is the response to dealing with racism, or somehow the ideas in the heads of white people that, well, I'm going to go take my course in unlearning racism, right, was going to resolve contradictions in the lives of African people. People in this room, of course, I don't have to convince how silly that is. But the reality, nevertheless, is that this is the prevailing notion in much of the rest of the world, and this is why this is such a profound meeting, because there's nothing up there that talks about solving the problem through making people like you. It says that overturning the racial divide through solidarity with African liberation. Because, and there's a big difference here, because if we want to overturn the racial divide by making white people like us, it does not presuppose that there's oppression anywhere in this relationship. It does not presuppose that there's good forces and there are bad forces in this relationship. That somehow white people have to come to terms to learn to like the naked savages, or the savages have to learn ourselves how to be worthy of acceptance, of being integrated with by white people. And how you have this tiny minority of the world's population And for everybody else to find some kind of security, our responsibility then is to integrate with this minority. The minority doesn't have to integrate with the rest of the world. It's our responsibility to integrate with this white minority. What an obscenity. And people in this room, of course, have no sympathy with that kind of notion. But also when we talk about this question of overturning the racial divide through solidarity with African liberation, we take it out of some narrow context and we throw it into a context that shares the experiences that we have in this room, in this city, in this country, with the experience of the vast majority of the people around the world. There is this habit of isolating our reality as though it were the only reality. It's not something that's peculiar to people in this country or people in this room. That's just the way folk do things if they don't have access to a reality that is greater than our own particular reality, which is why we go to places like Europe and we will hear somebody in Sweden who will say, well, it wasn't like that for us, talking about how white people are. It wasn't like that for us because they are familiar with, everybody's familiar with what white people have done to Africans in the United States. We had to be familiar with it because Africans were raising hell, rising up, trying to be free and struggling, and it was this massive repression that was necessary that was seen throughout the globe. But there weren't those explosions in Sweden because Swedish operations were happening in Ghana, where they built the slave castles, or they were happening off the coast, someplace in the Bahamas, where they had slave islands, where they actually gave, what do you call it when you come off the airplane and you got these places where you can buy duty-free, more or less. Slavery, really, you know, where selling mostly to the Ottoman Empire, and mostly women who were sold as sex slaves. So no, it didn't happen in Stockholm then. It was happening in other places that Swedes did it. And whether it happened that way or not, directly, it always happened. It always fed the development of all of Europe. All of Europe benefited from what is happening to Africans and the rest of the people because it resulted in the emergence of a world economy, a social system itself that dominated and continues to dominate, if shakily, the world today. So when we get involved in this, this is a really powerful and important discussion. And I want to say this also, that although we are minority opinion in this room, in the world, but it is a growing minority. And the power of the opinion that we have is in the fact that the ruling class has no answers to nothing, have no answers to anything. That's why all of a sudden, they're so knowledgeable about how to resolve the economic crisis in the world. Every now and then, you will see that, don't you? You read something, wow, we got it. They're so knowledgeable, but they were not able to see it coming, right? And they're so bright, they can bring out the best thinkers, the best economists that can say, this is how it's unfolding, this is what's in the future. Hell, they didn't see what the future was before 1987, or rather 2007. You know, so they don't understand anything, and everything they come up with, everybody, all of you know it's not true. That's why people still, you know, not heeding their advice in terms of how to prepare for retirement and and the rest of it. They you know that stuff is not true. And just like it's not true there, it's not true any other way. It's not true. They don't understand it. They have no idea what the hell is going on in the sense of being able to interpret it. But we do. And that's the thing that's made a difference, because when we go out into the world, and that's when you go and look at our movement around the world, you see a geriatric like myself. But this is not representative of our movement Our movement is an organization of young people stretching across the globe. Comrade Penny Hess just talked to you about the trip that we just made, the tour throughout Europe, where, first to Paris for African Liberation Day, where we brought African Liberation Day, this movement did, to Europe. And Comrade Farida there, who's not geriatric, was from a whole group of young people and who were there and from all over Europe, because they can hear the solutions for the contradictions that confront not just Africa and African people, but the world in African internationalism. So that's why they were able to join, and that's why Sister Farida is here with us on today, leaving all those other young comrades there. And from Paris to Cologne. And in Cologne, of course, the objective was to build the African People's Solidarity Committee, to begin the work to develop a solidarity committee. And as Comrade Penny said, that they don't have this experience that we have in the United States, because in Germany, the resistance, they were good at oppressing us in Tanzania and in Namibia and other places like that, but up until recently, they never had to contend with an African population in Germany. Unlike here, where there's an internal colony and has been internal colonialism since its inception, in Europe, most of Europe, the colonies were always someplace else. So while Africans in this country may have been convinced that what we were doing is fighting against racism from time to time, when we were in Namibia, we understood that we were fighting for independence and to get the colonizers out of our countries. But in Cologne, here we are, and we're among our friends in Cologne. When I say our friends, these are the progressive and sometimes Marxist and communist whites, who are down with the revolution, down, with revolution happening all over the world. They oppose, just like we are, just like you are, to everything that the U.S. is doing in most places around the world. But they didn't like it for us to say that in the United States, the remaining of those who were traditional custodians of the land are living in concentration camps that they call reservations. This is how they said in Germany, said, you can't say that. I said, why can't I say that? They said, because to say that is to equate that with what happened to the Jews in concentration camps. I said, but damn if I can't say that. But you are right that it is not a good comparison, because what happened to the indigenous people is worse than anything that ever happened to the Jews in Europe. It's worse. Where we don't know how many hundreds of millions of people died. And then they don't even get mentioned. They don't get mentioned. Nobody talks about the Holocaust when it comes to the indigenous people. Go ahead. See? So I say, so we can't say that. I say, I don't believe you're serious anyway. Because if you were really concerned about what happened to the Jews here in Germany, you would have given them Frankfurt as a national homeland, so they wouldn't have to be killing Palestinians right now. That was really something they weren't ready to talk about. So it was a good challenge, because it's illegal in parts of Europe to criticize the basic assumption about what happened to Jews around the Holocaust. You do that, you can go to jail. Did you know that? Oh, yeah. Yeah, and they talk about how the Muslims deny freedom of speech because you cannot desecrate, commit this other offense where it comes to the Prophet Muhammad, right? They don't believe in freedom. Go there and say something about the Holocaust in Germany. I mean, where they committed the offense. They committed the offense, right? But anyway, the point that I'm making is that there are those who would like to have us base this discussion on just fantastic things, on idealism, as opposed to getting to what the essence of the contradictions that we are confronted with are. And that's what we want to do. That's what this is so important. And we've already made tremendous progress around the world, because even though this is a minority view that we have here, it is not just a view that we have in this room. It's a view that's growing in various places where we're located around the world, and people are calling them. In fact, we're going to be talking to you soon about making contributions to fund the trip that I got to make to East Africa, Southern Africa, and various other places in the next several months, because this is the demand that's out in the world for African people to be organized. It's a growing view that's out there. It's not a minority view. It is, in many ways, and the problem, of course, is that most people are not talking to white people about this. People aren't calling white people together and say, look, this is how we see things, and we disagree with how you presented it in the past. They might get in an airplane and smash it into a twin tower, or they might do some other kinds of things. That's a part of the discussion, by the way. It's just held differently. And it's held from a different ideological and political framework. We don't think that's the best way to have that discussion. That's why we tell people who got their pilot's license to just use it for when we get ready to start transferring wealth back to Africa from where it belongs to. But there are these views that's out there, and they're speaking differently. And they contrast, they make a serious contrast with how Europe and white people have come to understand the world and yourselves. But people in this room are not surprised by that. Because we know in this room that half the people on earth live off less than $3 US a day. In this room, we're aware that 80% of the people on the planet Earth live off 10 or less US dollars a day. And that when you go to Africa, you're talking about people trying to survive off $1 a day. So in this room, it doesn't surprise us that damn 80% of the people trying to survive off $10 or less a day would have a different opinion about the world and how it functions and white people than white people have about the world and yourselves. That doesn't surprise us. We think that's rational, that's reasonable. But people are trying to survive of these conditions that have been imposed on them. Because when I say imposed on them, I'm talking about people who come from places on earth where most of the natural resources that make this country, that makes Europe wealthy, are located. So, yeah, that was distracting. So, I think it's what we're trying to do now is really important. We're trying to really help everybody come to terms with this relationship, with this reality. We want everybody to understand the nature of the social system that we're living in. I mentioned that we were in Cologne with folk who characterized themselves as Marxists and Maoists, and the same thing was true in various other places that we traveled. But there were also people woman from Algeria who spoke. There was a woman who spoke at the African Liberation Day the event that we had in Paris, who was from, I think, she may have been from Bolivia or Colombia, Bolivia, who spoke. There was a woman when I spoke in Berlin at Humboldt University who was a student there from Ecuador, an African from Ecuador. So this discussion that we're having is one that's penetrating consciousness of peoples around the world, and people have come to these kinds of conclusions, or coming to the same conclusions that we're talking about. So we're talking about building a real movement, because there's a lot that's happening in the world that we don't like, and people in this room don't like it. That's why you're here. Don't like the fact that everywhere you look, there's some war, some filthy, nasty war, not just a contest between equals, but where a country that has accumulated appropriated vast resources from the peoples around the world. A country that has a military budget that is 22 times larger than its closest competitor, making against people who don't even have bread to feed their children in places like Afghanistan. We don't like that. You don't like it. I don't like that. And we want to oppose that. We don't like that kind of stuff. We don't like it living in a situation where you've got a country that, in the name of helping Africa, would impose this whole military command. 12 million square miles of wealth. That's what we're looking at when we talk about 12 million square miles of wealth that's been looted for more than 500 years, which is a statement of this, how resource rich Africa is. And all of these resources being ripped off, and now the U.S. has imposed this AFRICOM on it. We don't like that. People in this room don't like that. I don't like that. And if there's anyone around the world who opposes what they're doing, assassination is the order of the day. How there was just a recent discussion in the U.S. Congress about giving an award to these cowards who sit behind computers in Colorado and places like that and direct drones to assassinate human beings in Pakistan. I don't like that. You don't like that. We oppose to that kind of stuff. That's why we come to this kind of meeting. We don't like the fact that we're living in a situation of permanent warfare. We don't like how the U.S. government has quarantined Cuba and this heroic population that's tried to defend revolution and stand upright in defense of the humanity of the planet Earth. We don't like what this government is doing. We don't like what they've done when they've just imposed a $2 million bounty on the head of Assata Shakur. We don't like that. People in this room don't like that. That's why we're here. That's why we're having this meeting. But in many ways, this does not distinguish us. The fact that we don't like these things going on. The question is, we have to understand the basis for it and how we deal with this. First of all, we hate capitalism. It has no redeeming qualities at all. Capitalism has no redeeming qualities at all. Capitalism is a foul, vile social system that can only exist as a consequence of exploiting the value, the labor power of other human beings around the world. That's one aspect of it. Most people who call themselves socialists and communists agree with that. Down with capitalism. Easy to say that. Down with capitalism. But one difference that we have that I think is fundamental is having an understanding of capitalism and its origin. Where does capitalism come from? What is its origin? We know that one of the most influential revolutionary thinkers of modern history, V.I. Lenin, talked about capitalism. And most of us have been influenced one way or another by Lenin, whether we are aware of it or not. We may not even be aware that the kinds of movement, so-called anti-imperialism, etc., we're involved in has been influenced by Lenin, but it has been. And because of the profound organizational impact, not only ideological, philosophical, that wasn't enough, but the Communist International and so-called revolutionary socialists all around the world being organized in various places around the world have carried Lenin's ideas and influenced liberals and revolutionaries around the world. And Lenin talked about imperialism. And there are people in this room who know what I'm talking about when he defined imperialism as something that was a consequence of capitalism having developed to its highest stage. He said that imperialism is capitalism that is rotten ripe. I said, I like that characterization, rotten ripe. I mean, I grew up in mango country, you understand? and rotten right. He said that, there are certain features of imperialism that have to do with a monopoly, having developed as a monopoly, and export of capital. And he talked about imperialism being capitalism that has become parasitic. And we say that Lenin missed it on that, because imperialism is not a consequence of the development of capitalism. Rather, capitalism is a consequence of the development of imperialism. And if you understand that the term imperialism actually comes from the word empire. And empire is that instance where a country and a people lives off other people's resources, what they extract from other people. And this became a debate in Europe. And Lenin's definition of, when I say it was debate, because there were other people with different definitions of what imperialism was. And Lenin's definition is the one that survived, mostly. But I want to share something with you, because Marx missed it too, and Marx was a pretty bright guy, I believe anyway. I just want to share something with you, because I want us to really try and get to the essence of the contradiction that we are living with, the nature of the problem that we are confronted with. What is this thing? We keep talking about racism and the racial divide and things like that. We need to come to terms with what it is that we're looking at. And I want to just say that Marx, I thought, in talking about capitalism and its origin, how it came into being, was able to talk about how capitalism had to have a beginning. He said in order for there to be capitalist production, there had to first be capitalist accumulation. Some of you read it, Marx, when he said this. This is in Capital. I think it's in part 8 of Capital. He says, but in order for there to be capitalist accumulation, there had to be capitalist production. He said, it looks like we're in this vicious circle. We can't get out of this except by presupposing that there was an accumulation of capital that was not the consequence of capitalist production, but a starting point. It was the starting point. He said this accumulation of capital, he referred to it as the primitive accumulation of capital. He said, among other things, it was the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. He said it was the war, 1841 and 42, that England made against China. That was referred to as the Opium War. That, you know about that war. We've experienced it here in this country in many different times, where England wanted tea from China. And China didn't want to trade tea with England. England wanted to trade the tea for opium. And as China would not agree to that, England fought a war. That's called the Opium War. Fought a war with China to force China to become a nation of junkies. We've experienced that in this community here. That imposition of a drug economy on our communities, and form of warfare. And all of this was a part of this thing they call the primitive accumulation of capital. It was colonialism that followed it. It was, if you look at what we now call America, this was a part of the primitive accumulation of capital. This was the process that dragged backwards disease-ridden, impoverished, unfree Europe out of 1,000 years of feudalism, of feudal existence. This was the process that dragged a disease-ridden, unfree Europe out of feudalism into what we now refer to as capitalism. It came as a consequence of the theft of resources of everybody around the world and the enslavement of African people. It came as a consequence of turning Africa itself, the entire continent of Africa, into a place for breeding human beings who would grow wealth for Europe and for North America throughout the world. It came as a part of the process that developed what we now know as Argentina and Cuba and all the places throughout the Americas. The so-called slave trade did that. This land, where concentration camps exist today, whose population are invisible to us, is a part of the primitive accumulation that brought wealth and resources to Europe, to North America, to white people at the expense of everybody else. Capitalism didn't turn parasitic. Capitalism was born parasitic. It was always parasitic. I want to share a couple of things with you, because I want to just share a couple of things with you. I don't do this well because I'm not as technologically advanced as a lot of the comrades who can stick stuff up there on the PowerPoints and make it, but I want to say this that I think is really important. This is something that comes from the main resolution to our first Congress in 1981, because one of the profound contradictions we are confronted with is North American or white opportunism. And understand what I mean by opportunism. It's simply sacrificing the long-term interest, in this instance, of the masses of humanity for the short-term interests of a small group. That's opportunism. Sacrificing the long-term interest, right? And so we say that the opportunism of the North American people, reflected in the opportunism of the North American left, remains the primary contradiction which prevents the unity of the North American working class and the African liberation movement in our struggle for independence through self-liberation. This opportunism is also the main contradiction confronting the development of the struggle for socialism. White people who come up with the concept of the national question, who deemed the struggles of Africans and other people as some kind of auxiliary thing that's to facilitate the advent of the white working class coming to power. This is the opportunism. And I want to just read a quote to you. I'm looking for it desperately. Like I said, I'm not very good at this. I only had a couple of days to try to pull much of this together since I've been in motion for a while now. There's a piece that appeared in the, I think, January New York Times. It's from an article, by a Harvard professor, Walter Johnson, that was called King Cotton's Long Shadow. And what this piece does is describe how slavery, African slavery, was actually first capital. It was, and he gives more or less the kind of evidence that most white people need for something. You hear that all the time. Say, well, white people have to have evidence. Unless it's OJ.
Right.
Which is not true. It just has to have evidence for something that contradicts the notion that they've always had. But it's empirical data that's involved here. But Johnson's article talked about this. He says that in the 1830s, hundreds of millions of acres of conquered land were surveyed and put up for sale by the United States. This vast privatization of the public domain touched off one of the greatest economic booms in the history of the world up to that time. Public domain, who's public? But anyway, investment capital from Britain, the continent, and the northern states poured into the land market. Under this stimulating process, prices rose like smoke. The journalist Joseph Baldwin wrote in his memoir, The Flush Times of Alabama and Mississippi. Without slavery, however, the survey maps of the General Land Office would have remained a sort of science fiction plan for a society that could never happen. Between 1820 and 1860, more than 1 million enslaved people were transported from the upper to the lower South. The vast majority by the venture capitalist slave traders, the slaves called soul drivers. The first wave cleared, you thought a soul driver was somebody who drove a Kia. The first wave cleared the region for cultivation. Forests were literally dragged out by the roots, the former slave John Parker remembered in his Promised Land. Those who followed planted the fields in cotton, which they then protected, picked, packed, and shipped from sunup to sundown every day for the rest of their lives. 85% of the cotton southern slaves picked was shipped to Britain. The mills that have come to symbolize the Industrial Revolution and the slave-tilled fields of the South were mutually dependent. Every year, British merchant banks advanced millions of pounds to American planters in anticipation of the sale of the cotton crop. Planters then traded credit in pounds for the goods they needed to get through the year, many of them produced in the North. From the rattle with which the nurse tickles the ear of a child born in the South to the shroud that covers the cold form of the dead, everything comes to us from the North, said one Southerner. And this is just to show the relationship of slavery to the North and the South, that it was not some Southern phenomenon, nor was it just some U.S. phenomenon. It was a phenomenon that grew the entire world economy. And this is something that is being made, point that's being made. And there is much more that he says. I'm not going to try to read all of this, but I think it's important to make the point that slavery was a foundation for the advent of capitalism. And in Capital, Marx stated that this thing that he referred to as primitive accumulation plays in political economy. Plays in political economy about the same part, Reverend Wright, as original sin in theology. Do you understand this? He's saying this slavery, the theft of the land from the indigenous people, all of this, he said in economic terms, in political economy, it plays about the same part as original sin in theology. We're talking about the advent of capitalism. Now, it came of selling black people and stealing land and resources from the vast majority of the peoples of the world. It is the thing that came into existence that snatched the feudalism out of existence and took the white people off the land as serfs, and then allowed for this, what was characterized by Marxists as progress, to occur with the advent of capitalism, so that what was next to a slave just yesterday could now go out and sell the value of his labor power to the highest bidder. This was the thing that rescued Europe from a state of feudal desperation, and of course it was disruptive a lot to the European society. He says Marx, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. And then he also said this unintentionally about the relationship between white workers and the rest of us, because we get extremely confused around this question. And I have to contend with white communists and socialists and progressives here all the time. This is what Marx said, and these are people who believe in Marx. He says that whilst the cotton industry introduced child slavery in England, it gave in the United States a stimulus to transformation of the earlier, more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed for its pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. Slavery pure and simple in the New World. That's pretty clear. All these people who read Marx, all this time and use Marx, they use capital mostly as something to hammer you on the head with, because they didn't read it, they just used the book. I want to share this with you. And this affects consciousness. It says that in a letter to Marx dated October 7, 1858, Engels wrote, "The English proletariat is actually becoming more and more bourgeois, so that this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming ultimately at the possession of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat alongside the bourgeoisie. For a nation which exploits the whole world, this is, of course, to a certain extent justifiable." He says in a letter to Kautsky, 1882, Engels wrote, "You ask me what the English workers think about colonial policy? Well, exactly the same as they think about politics in general." He said, "There's no Workers' Party here. There are only conservatives and liberal radicals, and the workers gaily share the feast of England's monopoly of the world market and the colonies." This is Engels is describing the reality that we confronted with even today. This is the same damn reality that we're confronted with. And what makes this really interesting and ironic in many ways is that Engels, supported Marx financially, because Engels' daddy was from the bourgeoisie, owned textile mills, the rest of it. I was just in, I wasn't there, but comrades, we got an organization in Wuppertal, which is in Germany. And Engels' daddy had a mill, had a factory in Wuppertal. And they used cotton textiles there. And so here you hear Marx, I've just quoted, talking about how cotton played such a role in the development of capitalism. Cotton also played a role in the development of Das Kapital. Because the reality is that it was Engels' support, 17 years that he was writing Capital, he was getting money from Engels' daddy, who was getting his money from slaves who were working in the goddamn plantations here in the U.S. South. I mean, that's the objective reality that we're talking about when we look at these relationships that as they existed in the real world. Not in some fanciful way, but in the real world, this is what we're talking about. So we look at a man called Jose Jaffe. He talks about how the rise of parasitic capitalism off the enslavement of Africa gave rise to the European or white world and provided the material basis of the European and consequently North American wealth that is considered the Western way of life by white people, including the advanced representatives. And I don't want to read all of this but he goes through the whole process of how Europe and from various locations, Portugal and etc. And you can find this in something that I've written. I think this is Easy Lake too. We have this in. But he says that the 15th century then saw the multiplication of the primary accumulation of European capitalism. And Africa played the most important part in the process as the principal arena of European colonialism, the very genesis and foundation of the capitalist system. From the turn of the 16th century, the Americas and Asia were added to this foundation, and out of this totality arose capitalism and modern Europe itself. Before capitalist colonialism, there was no Europe, only a collection of feudal, mercantile, and tribal towns, farms, villages, discrete states, and kingdoms vying and warring with each other, just as in Africa. but on a different property basis, that of private property in the land. Europe then was neither a concept nor a reality, at most a vague idea that Arabs, but not so-called Europeans, had long ago of someplace north of Greece. As long as Europe remained isolated from the world, there was no Europe. When it became connected with and depended on first Africa, then the Americas, and finally Asia, it became a reality and an idea. Only when Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Dutch, English, German, Danish, and Swedish confronted and clashed with Africa, America, and Asia did the need arise for them to consider themselves as a set, a whole, different from, hostile to, and eventually superior to Africans, Americans, and Asians. Colonialism gave them a common interest. We talk about what we call racism. We're talking about how it came into existence. And then finally, I want to share this with you. Because you know, Marx talked about how society consists of two parts, right? And this is in the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy that was written in 1859. Please bear with me. This is Marx, quote, "In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations which are independent of their will, namely the relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of consciousness." He said, the totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with existing relations of production. This merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, but the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. Okay. But the basic point, say, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. This is just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness. But on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production. In other words, this thing that we call racism, the ideas that's in the heads of white people, and they contradict most of what the world thinks about anything, is a basis. It is a creation. It is a creature. It is something that comes from an economic basis of slavery and colonialism. It is a natural consequence. Consciousness is born from this kind of relationship. That's the basic point that I wanted to make with you here. So when we talk about a struggle to overturn the racial divide, what we are actually talking about is a struggle to overturn a social system based on slavery and colonialism. You can't get to it any other way. So we can not like racism. I don't like it. You understand? We can not like war. I don't like it. We can not like all these things that the imperialists are doing. But they are natural consequences of a social system that was born of slavery and colonialism. So to not like it should mean that we have to do something to attack the contradiction, the real contradiction, the main contradiction. I'm not saying that there are not a lot of backwards white people who just don't like Africans. You can go any story that appears on the internet that has some reference to African people, go to the comment section. You see the most vile, hateful things you can. But what I am saying is that, and so that happens. That is out there. But what I am saying is the basis for the foundation for that is this political economy that was born from slavery and colonialism. It is what gives all of us our understanding about who we are and who the rest of the world is. And the problem, of course, is that Africans cannot live with this definition. And Arabs can't live with this definition. And people throughout what we call South America can't live with this definition. And increasingly what is becoming clear is that Europeans and white people can't live with this definition either. That's what 9/11 was about. You can't live with this definition, right? That's what the people rising up and challenging this reality is a statement that you cannot live with this definition reality. Penny Hess, Comrade Chairwoman Penny Hess quoted John Paul Sartre and his preface to The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And another thing he says in that is that when the colonized kills the colonizer, he kills two people. He kills the colonizer, say two people are destroyed, the colonizer and the colonized. You understand? When the colonized rises up to kill the colonizer, two entities are killed. The colonizer and the colonized. The colonizer must die, must be destroyed in order for the colonized to be able to live. And the objective here is to win the vast majority of the people onto the side of the colonized, to unite with the colonized to kill the colonizer, to destroy colonialism. And that is the way forward for everybody, because this doesn't make any, we know that we're living in a situation that doesn't make any sense at all. Why in the world would people continue to identify themselves with a social system that can only exist through stealing wealth and resources in the future of the vast majority of the people on earth? Why? Why would there be this kind of identification with this entity? You know, it is very deep and very profound. And today what we have is a situation where this thing that has been characterized by Marx as primitive accumulation can now speak to you. This thing that has been an object of history for all this time can now speak to you and say we are subjects of history. We are not just something that can be defined a certain way by white people, and that's the reality, that we have to somehow live up to the humanity or the humane status, standards or civilized standards of white people. We are having this discussion saying that you have to break free. You have to liberate yourselves from this relationship with the ruling class, with the white ruling class. You have to fight for black power, because it is white power that is responsible for every contradiction that people faced in the earth. Hold it. It is white power that is responsible for the oppression of white women. It is white power that is responsible for the oppression of white homosexuals. It is white power that is responsible for the oppression of white workers. It is white power that is responsible for the oppression of the vast majority of the people on the world. Everybody else is uniting against white power. It is the responsibility of Europe and you to join in this struggle. Join Uhuru Solidarity Movement. Uhuru.
One Africa! One Africa! Uhuru! Let's give another round of applause to Chairman Omali Yeshitela.